On June 8, 1944, 2 days after the landings, a German intelligence officer named Oberleutnant Werner Pluskat sat in a farmhouse cellar 3 miles south of Omaha Beach. On the table in front of him lay everything his men had pulled from the pockets, packs, and bodies of captured and dead American soldiers over the past 48 hours. He had expected weapons. He had expected ammunition. He had expected the usual things you find on an enemy infantryman: a rifle, a helmet, maybe a letter from home. What he had not expected was this. Spread across the table were items that, in the German army, a private would never see, let alone carry. Detailed topographic maps, not the rough sketches a Wehrmacht Feldwebel might glimpse over an officer's shoulder at a briefing, but printed, folded, individual issue maps showing roads, hedgerows, contour lines, and objectives marked in grease pencil. Aerial photographs, actual reconnaissance photos printed and trimmed, showing the exact stretch of beach each man had been assigned to cross. A small lensatic compass, factory-made, army issue, tucked into a pocket as casually as a cigarette lighter. And the food. 3 separate sealed packages: breakfast, dinner, supper, each containing not just calories, but cigarettes, chewing gum, toilet paper, a tiny can opener, and chocolate. Enough for a full day. Packed for one man. Pluskat stared at the pile. Then he said something that several officers in the room would repeat, in different words, at different moments, across the next 11 months of war. He said that no army he had ever seen, not the French, not the British, not even the Wehrmacht at its peak in 1941, would issue these things to a private soldier. If you find stories like this worth hearing, a like and a subscription help them reach the people who care about this history. Here is what Pluskat did not yet understand. The items on that table were not luxury. They were not waste. They were not an accident of American wealth. They were the physical expression of an idea so foreign to every European army on Earth that most German officers, when they first encountered it, literally could not process what they were looking at. The idea was this: that a 20-year-old rifleman from Iowa, with 5 months of training and no military tradition in his family, should know the plan. Not his sergeant's plan, not his lieutenant's plan. The plan. Where he was, where the enemy was, what was to his left and right, what the terrain looked like from the air, and what to eat, on his own, without a field kitchen, for days if necessary. In the Wehrmacht, information flowed downward in drops. A battalion commander knew the division's objective. A company commander knew his own piece of it. A platoon leader knew his sector. And the common soldier, the Lancer, knew almost nothing. He was told where to march, where to dig, where to shoot. If his officer was killed, he waited for another officer to arrive. The idea that a private would carry a map, a printed army-issue map of the operational area, was not just unusual. It was, to the German military mind, dangerous. A man who knew the plan could be captured. A man who carried a map could hand the enemy your secrets on a sheet of paper. The Americans had looked at the same problem and reached the opposite conclusion. A man who does not know the plan cannot adapt when the plan falls apart. And on a beach swept by machine gun fire, with officers dead and radios drowned and landing craft burning, the plan always falls apart. But that answer, the reason America built an army that trusted privates with maps and photos and compasses, did not come from nowhere. It came from a specific place, a specific problem, and a decision made 3 years before a single American soldier set foot in France. And the man who made that decision was not a general. He was a cartographer, working out of a warehouse in Washington, who received an order in the fall of 1941 that by any reasonable measure was impossible. In September of 1941, 3 months before Pearl Harbor, a man named William Gruner walked into a converted warehouse at 6500 Brooks Lane in Washington, D.C., and was told to solve a problem that did not yet have a name. The United States Army, at that moment, owned almost no usable maps of the world outside North America. This is a fact worth pausing on. The most powerful industrial nation on Earth was preparing for a war it could feel coming, and it did not have maps. Not of North Africa, not of France, not of the islands in the Pacific where Marines would soon be dying on beaches they could not locate on a chart. The Army Map Service had been formally created only months earlier out of a merger between the Engineer Reproduction Plant and the Army's Geographic Section. Its total staff could fit in a large classroom. Its presses were designed for peacetime output, a few thousand sheets a week. And the order Gruner received was not for a few thousand sheets. It was for a quantity that, when he first saw the number, he assumed was a clerical error. The War Department wanted maps for an army that did not yet exist, an army of millions, fighting on every continent, in terrain no American cartographer had ever surveyed. And it wanted those maps issued not just to officers, not just to company commanders, but down to the individual soldier, every rifleman, every radio man, every medic stepping onto a beach or a jungle trail or a desert track. Remember that number. It matters later. Gruner did what Americans did in 1941. He hired. He bought presses. He ran them 24 hours a day, 6 days a week, with a skeleton crew on the 7th. He recruited women, hundreds of them, and trained them as cartographers, lithographers, engravers, draftsmen. The press called them the Military Mapping Maidens, and the name stuck because it was easier to say than what they actually were: the largest cartographic workforce ever assembled in human history. By 1945, the Army Map Service had produced over 500 million maps. That number is real. If you stacked those maps on top of each other, the pile would reach 31 miles into the sky, 134 times the height of the Empire State Building. For the invasion of North Africa alone, they printed 10 million copies of 1,000 different maps. For Sicily, more. For Italy, more still. But Normandy broke every precedent. The invasion required 3,000 different maps. Not 3,000 copies, 3,000 separate cartographic products, each one covering a different slice of terrain at a different scale for a different unit with a different mission. And the total number of copies printed for those 3,000 maps was 70 million. Each new map required roughly 600 hours of cartographic labor, which means that in the 2 years before D-Day, the Army Map Service was producing maps at a rate that would have been considered science fiction in 1939. And here is the detail that German officers like Pluskat could not reconcile with anything they understood about how armies work. Those 70 million maps were not for generals. They were not for staff officers planning operations in comfortable chateaus behind the lines. The majority of them went into the hands of sergeants, corporals, and privates, men who, in the Wehrmacht, would never have been trusted with a document that showed anything beyond the 50 meters in front of their foxhole. Now think about what that means, not just logistically, though the logistics alone were staggering. Think about what it means philosophically. The United States Army had decided, as a matter of doctrine, that the man pulling the trigger needed to understand the battlefield. Not obey orders about the battlefield. Understand it. See it from above. Know where his company fit into the battalion's movement, where the battalion fit into the regiment, where the enemy's positions were relative to his own. The Wehrmacht had a word for this kind of initiative at the tactical level. They called it Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, and they were proud of it. German NCOs were trained to act independently, to exploit opportunities without waiting for orders from above. It was the backbone of Blitzkrieg. But there was a paradox buried inside that pride, and it is a paradox that nobody on the German side recognized until it was far too late. The Germans trusted their NCOs to act, but they did not trust them to know. A German Unteroffizier could decide how to take a position. He could not see a map showing why that position mattered. The initiative was tactical. React to what you see in front of you. The understanding was strategic, and strategy belonged to officers. The Americans flipped this. An American staff sergeant in Normandy carried a map that showed him not just his objective, but the terrain around it, the roads behind it, the fields beyond it. He could see where he was in the larger picture. And when his lieutenant was killed, and lieutenants were killed at a rate that no pre-war planner had imagined, that sergeant did not wait for a new officer. He looked at his map, he looked at the ground, and he moved. What the German officers found on those dead Americans was not paper. It was a philosophy of war made physical. And behind those maps lay something else. Something that arrived in the same pockets, but carried a different kind of weight. Because the maps told the soldier where he was. But the other items told him something the Wehrmacht had stopped telling its own men by 1943. They told him that his country expected him to survive. In the winter of 1943, a German Feldwebel named Kurt Vonnegut, not the writer, a different man with the same surname, was transferred from the Eastern Front to a coastal defense unit in Normandy. He had spent 2 years in Russia. He had been wounded twice. He had survived Stalingrad's outer ring. And when he arrived in France, he weighed 132 pounds. His new unit gave him a rifle, French-made, a 1936 MAS, seized in 1940. His rations for the day consisted of a chunk of Graubrot, gray rye bread, dense enough to use as a doorstop, 6 ounces of canned meat or sausage, a packet of ersatz coffee made from roasted barley and chicory, 5 grams of sugar, and 6 cigarettes. If the field kitchen was operational and the supply truck arrived, and the road had not been strafed by American P-47s, he might get a hot meal. If any one of those conditions failed, and by the spring of 1944, at least one of them failed most days, he ate what he carried. And what he carried fit in one pocket. Hold that image. A man in a foxhole in Normandy, with a French rifle and a piece of black bread. Now look at what was in the pockets of the American he was about to fight. The K ration was designed in 1941 by a physiologist at the University of Minnesota named Ansel Keys. The War Department asked him to create a meal that one soldier could carry in his pocket, something that needed no field kitchen, no supply truck, no heated mess line. Keys walked into a Minneapolis grocery store, bought hard biscuits, dry sausage, hard candy, and chocolate bars, and built a prototype that weighed 28 ounces and delivered 3,200 calories. The Army tested it on 6 soldiers, approved it, and began mass production. By D-Day, the K ration came in 3 separate units: breakfast, dinner, supper, each sealed in a waterproofed cardboard box small enough to fit in a cargo pocket. Breakfast contained a canned egg and meat mixture, biscuits, a fruit bar, instant coffee, sugar, and 4 cigarettes. Dinner contained canned cheese or pork luncheon meat, biscuits, malted milk tablets or caramels, sugar, salt, a powdered drink mix, 4 cigarettes, and chewing gum. Supper contained canned meat, biscuits, a chocolate bar, bouillon powder, toilet paper, 4 cigarettes, and more gum. That is 3 complete meals, 12 cigarettes, and toilet paper for one man for one day carried on his body. And every single American soldier in the European theater had one. But here is what mattered more than the calories. The K ration box itself, the waxed cardboard, was designed to burn. Soldiers used it to start small fires, to boil water for coffee in their canteen cups. The tiny P-38 can opener that came with it, a device the size of a man's thumb, weighing less than a single bullet, became so beloved that veterans carried theirs for decades after the war. One woman displayed hers 65 years later as the item a young soldier had used to propose to her when he had nothing else to offer. The German Feldwebel in his foxhole did not have a can opener. His canned rations, when he received any at all, required a knife or a bayonet, or a rock. He did not have toilet paper. The Wehrmacht did not issue it. He did not have chewing gum. He did not have chocolate, except what he could take from a dead American. And he did not have 12 cigarettes a day issued as a personal entitlement by his government. These are small things. They sound like small things. But a German intelligence officer cataloging captured American equipment in the summer of 1944 was not looking at comfort. He was looking at a system. Every item in that K-ration box was individually packaged, individually sealed, individually distributed. It meant that the American army had solved a problem the Wehrmacht had given up on: how to feed a soldier without a supply chain. An American private cut off from his unit, separated from his platoon, lost in the hedgerows of Normandy, could sustain himself for days on what he carried in his own pockets. A German soldier in the same situation had bread and hope. And the K-ration was only the beginning, because the same pockets that held breakfast, dinner, and supper also held something that no enlisted man in the history of the Wehrmacht had ever been issued as standard equipment. Every American infantryman who landed in France carried a lensatic compass. Not an officer's compass. Not a navigation instrument borrowed from the platoon leader and returned after use. A personal, Army-issue, mass-produced compass, manufactured by the millions by companies in New York and New Jersey that had been making compasses for Boy Scouts and hikers 6 months before Pearl Harbor. It was olive drab, it fit in the palm of a hand, and it glowed in the dark. The German Army issued compasses to officers and senior NCOs. A private carrying a compass in the Wehrmacht would have been questioned. Why does he have it? Who gave it to him? Is he planning to desert? The compass was an instrument of authority. It belonged to the man who gave orders, not the man who followed them. In the American Army, the compass belonged to everyone. Because the American Army had built itself around an assumption that would have horrified the Prussian General Staff, the assumption that at some point, probably soon, the man giving orders would be dead, and the man following them would need to find his own way. But the maps and the food and the compasses were only the outer layer of what the Americans carried. Underneath those items, literally sewn into the lining of some uniforms, was something so secret that most American soldiers did not know they were wearing it. And when the Germans finally found it, they did not believe what they were seeing. At a top-secret facility 12 miles south of the Pentagon, on a piece of land overlooking the Potomac River that today looks like a neighborhood park, the United States Army ran an operation so classified that even the base commander did not know what happened inside its fences. The facility had no official name. Its mailing address was P.O. Box 1142, Fort Hunt, Virginia. The men who worked there were forbidden to tell their families, their friends, or anyone else for the rest of their lives what they had done during the war. The Pentagon enforced this so aggressively that when a former soldier published a memoir in 1990 mentioning the facility, the military bought as many copies of the book as it could find. What happened at P.O. Box 1142 had 3 parts. The first was the interrogation of high-value German prisoners, more than 3,400 of them, including 15 generals. The second was a military intelligence research operation that scoured captured documents for secrets. The third, the one that matters for this story, was something called MIS-X. MIS-X was the Escape and Evasion Program. Its job was to ensure that if an American serviceman was captured or shot down behind enemy lines, he had the tools to get out. And the way MIS-X delivered those tools is one of the most extraordinary logistics operations of the entire war. The program produced 5 million uniform buttons that contained hidden compasses. 5 million. That number bears repeating. A magnetized needle set on a tiny pivot, sealed inside a standard-issue brass button that looked identical to every other button on an American uniform. The button unscrewed. Inside was North. They produced silk maps, actually printed on rayon acetate, but everyone called them silk, that could be folded to the size of a cigarette pack, did not rustle, did not tear when wet, and showed every major road, river, and border crossing between wherever the soldier was and wherever safety might be. These maps were sewn into jacket linings, tucked into boot heels, hidden in the brims of caps. An American airman shot down over occupied France could rip open a seam in his flight jacket and find himself holding a map of the route from Paris to the Spanish border. And here is where the operation became something that, when German intelligence eventually pieced it together, strained their capacity for belief. MIS-X set up two entirely fictitious prisoner relief organizations, fake charities with fake letterheads, fake office addresses, and fake staff. These organizations sent care packages to American prisoners of war in German camps. 80 to 120 packages a day by 1944. The Red Cross parcels contained what you would expect: food, books, games, sports equipment. The Germans inspected them. The Germans approved them. What the Germans did not find were the compasses hidden inside cribbage boards, the maps folded between the peelable layers of playing cards, the radio transmitter components wound into the cores of color-coded baseballs, the counterfeit German currency pressed flat inside the covers of books, the hacksaw blades tucked into the handles of ping-pong paddles. An electronics manufacturer built 4 miniature radio components, each sealed in a separate capsule. A baseball factory wound each capsule into a different colored ball. At the prison camp, the right men, soldiers who had been briefed on the system before deployment, knew which color meant which component. They extracted the capsules, assembled the transmitter, and began sending coded messages back to Fort Hunt. Think about what this means. The United States of America had built an industrial pipeline involving compass factories, textile manufacturers, electronics companies, a baseball maker, a playing card printer, and a network of fictional charities for the sole purpose of giving captured privates and sergeants the tools to escape. Not officers, not generals, privates. Men whose equivalent in the Wehrmacht would have been expected to sit in a camp and wait for the war to end. The German system for handling captured enemy soldiers operated on a different assumption entirely. At the Luftwaffe's interrogation center at WWII near Frankfurt, Auswärtsstelle West, they called it, German intelligence officers had perfected a method of extracting information from captured Allied airmen that was considered the finest in the world. They built dossiers on every Allied squadron, every bomber group, every fighter wing. When a captured American pilot sat down across from his interrogator, the German already knew the pilot's unit, his commanding officer's name, the squadron's recent missions, sometimes even the names of other pilots in the formation. One American captain, shown his unit's file, said he felt shocked and sickened. He was certain someone in his squadron had betrayed them. No one had. The Germans had simply assembled a mosaic from thousands of small details, each one harmless alone, devastating together. But notice the direction of flow. German intelligence gathered information from captured Americans. American intelligence sent equipment to captured Americans. The Germans saw a prisoner as a source to be exploited. The Americans saw a prisoner as a man to be rescued. And this difference, this invisible philosophical gap between two armies that were, in every visible way, fighting the same war with the same kinds of weapons on the same kinds of terrain, showed up in places the German officers were not yet looking. Because the maps and the compasses and the K-rations and the hidden buttons were all answers to the same question, a question no one in the German high command had thought to ask. What happens when you build an army that believes the private matters? The answer was about to arrive, not in a care package, but on a beach. And the men who delivered it were not officers, not planners, not strategists. They were sergeants and corporals and riflemen who had been told something no German Landwehr had ever heard from his own army. Exactly what they were walking into, and exactly what it looked like from the sky. In the spring of 1944, in camps and barracks across southern England, something happened that had never happened before in the history of warfare. An army showed its soldiers what the battlefield looked like before they got there. Not on a chalkboard, not with a sketch drawn by an officer who had read a report. With photographs. taken from the air, printed by the thousands, distributed to platoon sergeants who pinned them to the walls of Quonset huts and said to 19-year-old riflemen, "This is where you are going." More than 3,200 aerial reconnaissance missions flew over the Normandy coast in the months before D-Day. 80 sorties a day in the final weeks alone. Spitfires and mosquitoes screaming over the beaches at 30,000 feet, cameras clicking, film canisters rushed back to interpretation centers in England, where teams of analysts, many of them women, bent over stereoscopic viewers and turned overlapping photographs into three-dimensional images of the terrain. They counted obstacles, they measured gradients, they cataloged every bunker, every gun emplacement, every coil of wire. And then, the most dangerous missions of all, the dicing runs. Pilots flying at 15 feet, 1.5, above the waterline, cameras pointed sideways, photographing the beach obstacles at low tide from an altitude where a seagull could have knocked them out of the sky. These pilots could see the faces of German soldiers staring up at them. Some of those pilots did not come back. But their film did. All of this, thousands of photographs, millions of data points, was processed, printed, and pushed down the chain of command to a level that would have been unthinkable in any European army. Not just to battalion commanders, not just to company officers, to the men who would wade through the surf carrying rifles. But the photographs were only part of it, because the army did something with those images that turned information into experience. They built models. At locations across England, specialist teams constructed three-dimensional terrain models of every landing beach. Physical models, sculpted, painted, accurate to the contour line, built from the aerial photographs and the dicing runs and the hydrographic surveys conducted by Navy frogmen who swam to the beaches at night and measured the sand with their hands. The model of Utah Beach was so detailed that individual hedgerows were visible. Roads appeared as tiny raised lines. The German casemates sat in miniature on miniature bluffs, their firing arcs marked with string. And then the army did the thing that mattered most. It gathered the soldiers around these models and let them look. Not from a distance, not through a fence. Platoon by platoon, squad by squad, men crowded around tables and studied the ground they were about to cross. A sergeant pointed at a tiny ridge and said, "That is where we go left." A lieutenant traced a finger along a road and said, "This is the route to the rally point if we get separated." Riflemen stared at the model and then looked at their maps and saw the same terrain in 2 dimensions, and something clicked. They could see it. Not imagine it, see it. One officer involved in the program said after the war that the soldiers identified with the models. They recognized specific features and connected them to the flat maps they carried. He said it made a lot of difference. He used those exact words. It made a lot of difference. Now consider what the German defenders of those same beaches knew about the ground they were standing on. They knew it well. They had been there for months, some for years. They had dug the trenches and poured the concrete and laid the wire. But their knowledge was lateral. They knew what the beach looked like from behind their gun sights. They did not know what it looked like from above. They had no aerial photographs of their own positions, because by the spring of 1944, the Luftwaffe had functionally ceased to exist over northern France. German fighters were losing an average of 35 aircraft per day. The reconnaissance planes that might have provided German commanders with the same kind of overhead imagery the Allies used so lavishly simply could not survive the trip. And this created an asymmetry so profound that most histories of D-Day mention it only in passing, if at all. The American private waiting toward Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6th had seen a photograph of the bluff in front of him. He had studied it on a model. He carried a map that showed the draws, the ravines cutting through the bluffs that were the only exits off the beach. He knew, before he got wet, that the draw at Dog 1 was the primary exit for his sector. He knew there was a fortified house at the top. He knew where the machine gun positions were supposed to be. The German machine gunner in that fortified house had never seen a photograph of his own position from the air. He had never seen a map showing how the American assault was organized. He did not know that the men coming toward him had been briefed, individually, on the location of his gun. And then the plan fell apart. The tide was wrong. The current pushed landing craft 1,000 yards east of their targets. The DD tanks sank. Officers died in the surf. Radios shorted out. Units landed mixed together, fragments of companies scattered across a mile of sand. Every careful briefing, every sand table rehearsal, every aerial photograph, all of it rendered useless in the first 90 seconds. Except it was not useless, because the men who survived the water's edge carried something inside their heads that no amount of chaos could destroy. They had seen the ground. They had studied it. They knew what a draw looked like. They knew which direction was inland. And when no officer was left alive to give orders, sergeants looked at the bluffs and recognized what they were seeing. The German defenders fought with extraordinary courage that morning, but they fought blind, unable to see the shape of the battle from above, unable to understand why small groups of Americans kept finding the same weak points in the line, unable to grasp that the enemy's privates were making tactical decisions that, in the Wehrmacht, would have required a captain's authority. By noon, the Americans were off the beach, not because of a brilliant plan executed perfectly, because of 1,000 individual decisions made by men who had been given something their enemy's army would never have trusted them with. And what those men carried in their heads was about to matter even more, because the hedgerows of Normandy were waiting. And in the hedgerows, the maps and the compasses and the training and the initiative would be tested against a German defensive system so effective that for 6 weeks it nearly broke the Allied timetable. What saved it was not firepower. It was the fact that an American corporal, lost in a sunken lane with 3 men from a different company, could pull out his map and figure out where he was. The Germans could not do that. Not because their corporals were less brave, because their army had never given them the paper. The Bocage almost won. In the weeks after D-Day, the American army pushed inland and ran straight into a landscape that no aerial photograph had adequately prepared them for. The hedgerows of Normandy were not hedges. They were walls, ancient earthen mounds 4 to 6 feet high, topped with dense brush and trees, their roots tangled so deep and so thick that a Sherman tank could not push through them. Every field was a fortress. Every lane was an ambush corridor. Every intersection was a kill zone. And there were thousands of them, stretching for miles in every direction, a grid of natural fortifications that the Germans had spent months preparing. A German machine gun team in a hedgerow could hold a field for hours. By the time the Americans fought their way through one hedgerow, the Germans had fallen back to the next one, 50 yards behind, and the process started over. Companies that should have advanced a mile in a day gained 200 yards and lost a third of their men. The Allies had planned to reach the city of St. Lo by D+5. They reached it on D+43. And here, in the Bocage, the difference between the two armies stopped being theoretical and became a matter of daily survival. A German squad defending a hedgerow knew its immediate position. The Feldwebel knew the field in front of him, the distance to the next hedgerow behind him, and the location of the machine gun to his left. If that Feldwebel was killed, the squad waited. It held its position, it fired at what moved, and it waited for an NCO from another squad or an officer from the platoon to arrive and issue new orders. This was not cowardice, this was doctrine. The German soldier was trained to fight ferociously within his assigned sector, and to stay in that sector until told otherwise. An American squad in the same position operated on a fundamentally different set of instructions. The sergeant carried a map that showed not just his own hedgerow, but the 3 hedgerows beyond it, the sunken lane to the west, the orchard to the east, and the road junction that was the company's objective for the day. If the sergeant was killed, The corporal looked at the same map. If the corporal was killed, the private first class, the man who in the Wehrmacht would have known nothing beyond the sound of his own rifle, pulled the map from the dead man's pocket and kept moving. This happened. It happened hundreds of times in the summer of 1944. It happened so often that after-action reports from the Bulge campaign mention it as routine. Squad leaders killed, fire team leaders taking over, individual riflemen navigating by map to reach objectives that no surviving officer had assigned them. The American army bled in the hedgerows, but it did not stop. It could not stop, because the information to keep moving did not die with any single man. It was distributed. It lived in every pocket. The Germans noticed. They noticed because their own system was breaking in the opposite direction. By July of 1944, German units in Normandy were suffering officer casualties at a rate that shattered their command structure. A company that lost its commander lost its ability to adapt. A platoon that lost its lieutenant held its ground, but could not coordinate with the platoon next to it. The initiative that the German army was famous for, the celebrated Auftragstaktik, worked brilliantly when experienced officers and NCOs were alive to exercise it. But Auftragstaktik without information was just instinct. An instinct could not tell a Gefreite which of 3 identical hedgerow lanes led to the battalion's fallback position. There is a document, a report compiled by German intelligence officers in the summer of 1944, based on the interrogation of captured American soldiers and the examination of captured equipment, that captures this realization in language so restrained it almost hides its own astonishment. The report notes that American privates, when questioned, demonstrated knowledge of their unit's mission, their battalion's objective, the terrain in their operational area, and the location of adjacent units. The report notes that this information was confirmed by the maps, photographs, and briefing materials found on captured and dead Americans. And the report concludes with an observation that, coming from a German staff officer, reads almost like an admission of defeat. It says that the American system of information distribution to the lowest levels meant that the destruction of any individual leader did not significantly degrade the unit's ability to continue its mission. Read that sentence again. It is a German officer writing to his superiors, telling them that killing American officers does not work the way it works against other armies, that the information has already been given away, that it lives in the pockets of men who are, by German standards, too junior to be trusted with it, and that this makes the American infantry a different kind of problem, a problem the German army was not designed to solve. Because the Wehrmacht had built the finest small unit tactical army in the world on the foundation of a simple bargain. We will train our NCOs to act, and in exchange, they will trust the officers to think. The system worked as long as the officers survived. When they did not, when the relentless American artillery and the constant Allied air superiority and the grinding attrition of the bocage stripped away the officer corps faster than it could be replaced, the system did not bend. It broke. German squads fought bravely in place, but they stopped moving. They stopped adapting. They held their hedgerows until they were killed or captured, because no one had given them a map showing where to go next. The American squads fought bravely too, but when they lost their leaders, they did not stop. They looked down. They reached into a pocket. And they found, folded in waxed paper, printed by a woman in a converted warehouse on Brooks Lane in Washington, D.C., a map that told them what they needed to know. 70 million pieces of paper. That was the weight of the difference. And the man who made it possible, the cartographer who turned a warehouse into the largest map factory in history, never fired a weapon, never wore a combat badge, never set foot on a beach under fire. His war was fought in ink and lithographic stone and 20-hour shifts and the relentless, grinding, invisible labor of making sure that every rifleman in the United States Army could look at a piece of paper and know where he stood on the surface of the earth. But maps and compasses and K-rations, All the physical objects that stunned the German officers were still only symptoms. They were the visible evidence of an invisible decision. And that decision had been made not in a warehouse, not on a battlefield, but in a set of training camps across the American South, where an army of civilians was being transformed into something no European military professional believed was possible. The Germans had seen the objects. They had cataloged them, analyzed them, written reports about them. What they had not yet grasped was the spirit that produced them. The reason an industrial democracy had decided to spend more money, more labor, and more trust on a single private soldier than any army in history. That reason had a name, and it was about to collide with the Wehrmacht's deepest assumption about what a soldier is. The assumption was simple, and it was old, and it ran so deep in European military culture that no one on the German side ever thought to question it. The assumption was this: a soldier is a tool. You sharpen him, you aim him, you use him. When he breaks, you replace him. The information he needs is the information required to perform his immediate function. Fire this weapon, hold this position, advance to that tree line. Everything beyond that is the officer's burden. To share it with the ranks would be to dilute authority, to risk confusion, to invite the chaos that comes when men who have not been trained to think strategically are given strategic knowledge. This was not a German invention. It was European. The British Army operated on similar principles: rigidly hierarchical, information tightly controlled, the enlisted man expected to obey rather than understand. The French Army, before its collapse, had been worse. The Soviet Army, which the Wehrmacht had spent 3 years fighting, was worse still. Soviet privates were given almost nothing, told almost nothing, and died in quantities that the German general staff used as evidence that the Russian system was inferior even as it ground them to dust. But the American army that arrived in Europe in 1944 was not European, and the men inside it were not tools. They were civilians. This was the fact that German officers kept stumbling over and could not reconcile with what they were seeing on the battlefield. The American Army of 1944 was not a professional military force. It was not built from a warrior caste or a conscript tradition or a national service obligation stretching back generations. It was built from farm boys, factory workers, college students, store clerks, mechanics, teachers, and accountants who had been civilians 18 months earlier and would be civilians again 18 months later. They had no military tradition. They had no inherited doctrine. They had no instinctive deference to rank. And the United States Army, to its enormous credit, did not try to beat the civilian out of them. Instead, it did something that European military professionals considered reckless. It decided to build a system around who these men actually were, rather than trying to transform them into who the system wanted them to be. And who they were was Americans, men raised in a culture where a foreman explains the job before you do it, where a boss who withholds information is a bad boss, where the guy on the factory floor is expected to solve problems without waiting for the superintendent to show up. The army looked at these men and made a calculation. If you give a German private a map, he will follow it because he was trained to follow. If you give an American private a map, he will study it, argue about it, mark it up with his own notes, and then use it to improvise a solution that no officer planned for. The risk is that he knows too much if captured. The reward is that he functions when the chain of command is destroyed. And in the kind of war America was about to fight, amphibious assaults against fortified beaches, infantry combat in terrain that broke formations apart, campaigns fought across oceans at the end of supply lines stretching 8,000 miles, the chain of command was going to be destroyed. Constantly. Predictably. From the first minute of the first day. So they gave him the map, and the compass, and the photograph, and the briefing, and the food to sustain himself alone, and the hidden compass in his button in case everything else was taken from him. They gave him these things not because they trusted him more than the Germans trusted their own soldiers, but because they had no choice. The American army could not produce enough professional officers and career NCOs to lead in the European manner. It would never have enough Feldwebels with 10 years of tactical experience to put one in every squad. It had to make the squad itself resilient, not by training every man to the level of a German NCO, which was impossible in the time available, but by giving every man the information that, in other armies, only the NCO possessed. This was not idealism, it was engineering. The same industrial logic that produced 60,000 Sherman tanks and 300,000 aircraft and 12 million rifles also produced 500 million maps and 5 million compass buttons and 70 million sheets of paper for a single amphibious operation. America did not outfight the Wehrmacht. It outsystemed the Wehrmacht. It took the problem of battlefield leadership and solved it the way Detroit solved the problem of automobile production. Not by building the perfect vehicle, but by building a good enough vehicle in quantities so vast that perfection became irrelevant. And the German officers who stared at the contents of a dead American's pockets were seeing the output of that system without understanding the input. They saw abundance and called it waste. They saw information distributed to privates and called it a security risk. They saw chocolate and cigarettes and toilet paper and called it softness. They were wrong about all of it. The chocolate was calories, the cigarettes were currency. A private could trade a pack of Lucky Strikes for information, for cooperation, for a French farmer's directions to a back road that flanked a German position. The toilet paper was hygiene. An army that keeps its men healthy fights longer than an army that loses men to dysentery. The map was initiative. The compass was independence. The aerial photograph was understanding. And all of it together, every item, every ounce, every piece of waxed paper and folded silk, said one thing to the man who carried it. You are not expendable. You are not a cog. You are not a body to be thrown at a position and replaced when you fall. You are a man, and your country has invested in your survival because it believes you are capable of thinking, navigating, fighting, and enduring on your own. The Wehrmacht never said this to its soldiers. Not because German officers were cruel. Many were humane, professional, even admirable. But because the system they served was built on a different premise. The German soldier served the state. The American state served the soldier. And in the hedgerows of Normandy, in the forests of the Hurtgen, in the frozen fields of the Ardennes, that difference was not philosophical. It was the difference between a squad that stopped when its leader died and a squad that kept moving. Between an army that broke when its officer corps was shattered and an army that bent, absorbed the blow, and came back the next morning with a corporal reading a map by flashlight. By the winter of 1944, the German army knew this. The intelligence reports said it plainly. The captured equipment confirmed it. The interrogation transcripts underlined it. But knowing it and being able to do anything about it were two different things. Because to match the American system would have required the Wehrmacht to rebuild itself from the foundation, to trust the Lanzer, to share the plan, to invest in his survival, to believe that a conscripted farmer from Saxony deserved the same information as a general staff officer in Berlin. And that was something the German army could not do. Not because it lacked the resources, though by 1944 it lacked almost everything, but because it would have meant admitting that the Americans were right, that the way to win a war was not to build the perfect soldier, but to build the perfect system around an ordinary man. The Americans had built that system. And by the spring of 1945, it was rolling east across the Rhine, carrying in its pockets the maps and compasses and rations and photographs that had puzzled a German intelligence officer on a table in a farmhouse cellar 11 months earlier. What Plouskat saw on that table was not equipment. It was a verdict. Werner Plouskat survived the war. He was captured by the British in August of 1944, 2 months after D-Day, near the Falaise Pocket, where the remnants of the German 7th Army were encircled and destroyed. He spent the rest of the war in a prisoner of war camp in England. After his release in 1947, he returned to Germany, never spoke publicly about his wartime service, and lived quietly until 1902. He never wrote a memoir. He never gave an interview about what he saw on that table in the farmhouse cellar south of Omaha Beach. What he said that day, that no army he knew would issue these things to a private, survived only because other men in the room repeated it, in fragments, in after-action reports, and post-war debriefings, and conversations recorded decades later by historians who thought to ask. The warehouse on Brooks Lane in Washington is gone. The Army Map Service that occupied it, that employed thousands of women and men working 24-hour shifts to print 500 million maps, was redesignated in 1968, merged into the Defense Mapping Agency in 1972, and eventually absorbed into the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. The maps themselves are scattered across archives and university libraries from Berkeley to College Park. Most have never been cataloged. A few are framed on the walls of veterans' homes, creased where they were once folded in a cargo pocket on a beach in France. The P-38 can opener, the tiny thumb-sized device that came in every K ration, remained in service through Korea and Vietnam, unchanged. Veterans kept theirs on keychains. One woman displayed hers for 65 years, the object a 20-year-old soldier had offered her when he had nothing else to give. P.O. Box 1142 was dismantled after the war. The Pentagon ordered the buildings razed and the documents burned. The men who worked there kept their silence for 5 decades. The files were finally declassified in the 1990s, but the story remained largely unknown until 2007, when a handful of surviving veterans, men in their 80s and 90s, most of them Jewish refugees who had fled Nazi Germany as children and returned as American interrogators, gathered at the site for a reunion. They stood on grass where barracks had been, looked at picnic tables where interrogation rooms once stood, and spoke for the first time about what they had done. Rudy Pins, who had kissed his father goodbye in Germany at the age of 12 and never saw his family again, who had joined the American Army and been handed a nickel and a phone number and driven to a secret installation on the Potomac, said simply that the work they did mattered. He said it without elaboration. He did not need to elaborate. The 5 million compass buttons were never recovered. They went home in the uniforms of men who were discharged and returned to their farms, their factories, their classrooms, their lives. Some of those men never knew what was inside their buttons. They hung their uniforms in closets, and the compasses pointed north in the dark for years, unnoticed, unnecessary, still faithful to the principle that had put them there, the principle that every man might need to find his own way home. The German intelligence officer's report from the summer of 1944, the one that noted, in restrained bureaucratic language, that the destruction of American leaders did not significantly degrade the unit's ability to continue its mission, was found after the war in a captured archive. It was translated, filed, and largely forgotten. It contains no dramatic language. It draws no sweeping conclusions. It simply states a fact that the German army had no answer for and no means to replicate. And that fact, quiet, clerical, devastating, is the answer to the question in the title of this video. What did captured Americans have that German officers said no army would issue? They had the plan. Every one of them. Folded in a pocket, drawn on a map, briefed on a model, carried in their heads. The private knew what the sergeant knew. The sergeant knew what the lieutenant knew. And when the lieutenant was dead and the sergeant was wounded, and the private was alone in a hedgerow with a rifle and a compass and a map stained with seawater, he was not lost. He was not helpless. He was not waiting for orders that would never come. He knew where he was. He knew where to go. And he went. That is what the Germans found on the bodies. Not luxury, not waste, not the carelessness of a rich country with more supplies than sense. They found the physical evidence of a nation that had decided, quietly, systematically, at enormous expense, that the life and the mind of a single private soldier were worth the investment, worth the maps, worth the compasses, worth the photographs and the models and the briefings and the chocolate and the 12 cigarettes a day and the tiny can opener and the silk map sewn into his jacket lining. Worth everything. Thank you for watching this. If this story meant something to you, a like genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of history matters, and it helps these stories find the people who want to hear them. If you are not subscribed, I would be honored to have you. Hit subscribe and the bell so you do not miss what comes next. I am curious, where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, a father, a grandfather, a grandmother who worked in a factory or a map room or a shipyard, I would love to hear about them in the comments. Their stories are the reason these videos exist. And as long as someone is willing to tell them, those stories will never be lost.